Chicago, 1920s. Prohibition has gripped the nation, turning the Windy City into a war zone. With alcohol outlawed, the streets are not just soaked in bootleg whiskey, but also soaked in blood. Gangs don't just compete, they annihilate one another in a ruthless battle for control over the city's lucrative beer rackets. The territory was divided like this. Al Capone's Chicago outfit held the lion's share of the power, but beyond Capone's reach, a deadly patchwork of rival factions claimed what territory remained. Madman McCurlane and Spike O'Donnell ruled the far south side. The Irish Northsiders held firm up north. Frankie Lake and Terry Druggan's Valley Gang kept a strong hold over Lawndale, and Roger Toohey governed Garfield and Humboldt Park. All of these were heavy hitters, killers, titans of the underworld. But nestled in the heart of this chaos, in a blood-soaked corner of Little Italy, were 6 Sicilian brothers who fought like Roman warriors defending an empire. They didn't just survive, they absolutely dominated, with bullets, blades, bombs, and brutality. They made millions, they terrified rivals, and, for a time, not even Al Capone himself dared to cross them. They were the most savage clan in a city full of savage clans. This is the story of Chicago's most bloodthirsty crime family you've never heard of. This is the story of the terrible Gennas.
The small town of Marsala, located on the sun-drenched western edge of Sicily, was once the heart of the island's rich agricultural life. Known for its fortified Marsala wine, the region had long flourished on the strength of its vineyards, producing a renowned, full-bodied wine that had made the town famous around the world. For centuries, this was a town built on the bounty of its land, where the livelihood of many families, including that of Antonino Genna, depended on the cultivation of grapes. Unfortunately, no pictures of Antonino Genna have survived, but he was born into a peasant family in Marsala sometime in the 1850s and spent his early life working the family's vineyard, a tradition that was passed down through generations. Like most in Sicily at the time, Antonino Genna lived off the land, tending to the grapevines and ensuring that his family had enough to survive. Life may have been hard, but it was a way of life that felt as natural as the sun setting over the vineyards. Antonino married Maria Conchetta Utica sometime in the 1870s, and they built a family over the next 2 decades. Antonino and Maria had 7 sons. Pietro, the eldest, born in 1881, Salvatore, born in 1884, Vincenzo in 1888, Antonio in 1890, Michele, whom they all called Mike, was born in 1895, Angelo came along in 1898, and the youngest was Nicola, born in 1901. They also had 2 daughters, Rose Laudicina and Caterina Mariana, which, like their parents and youngest brother Nicola, no photos have survived. For years, Antonino carried on his work to support his wife and 9 children, farming the land, living simply but surviving. In Marsala, the annual harvest dictated the rhythm of life. It was a steady existence, but as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Marsala, like much of Sicily, was grappling with severe economic decline. The vineyards of Marsala, which had once been the pride of the region, began to falter under a series of economic pressures. Market fluctuations, modern production methods, and the rise of cheaper, mass-produced wines from other regions began to take their toll. What had once been a booming wine industry now struggled to maintain its former glory, and Marsala's famed reputation for quality wines slowly began to erode. The decline was swift and devastating. As demand for fine wines fell, Local producers, desperate to keep pace with the changing market, began cutting corners. They started using inferior grapes and producing cheaper, overly sweetened wines. The result was a product far removed from the rich wine that had once been a symbol of elegance and sophistication. By the early 1900s, Marsala wine, once a prized name in the wine world, had become known more as a cooking wine than the refined beverage it had once been. For Antonino Genna, this shift spelled disaster. The family's livelihood, built on the land and the grapevines, was slipping away. Opportunities in Sicily were dwindling, and Antonino, seeing no future in the crumbling agricultural economy, made the difficult decision to leave his homeland. His dream of providing a better life for his children could no longer be realised in Sicily, so, with what little savings he had left, Antonino made plans to take his family across the Atlantic to America, where rumours of work and a fresh start promised hope. This journey to America, a common tale for many Sicilian families in the early 1900s, was not one taken by wealthy landowners, but by poor working-class families seeking a new beginning. The idea of America as a land of opportunity spread through Sicily like wildfire. Many Italians who had already made the journey to America and found work started sending back letters and stories to the Italians still in Sicily, painting a picture of prosperity and hope. These immigrants spoke of jobs, land, and the chance to escape the crushing poverty that now defined life in Sicily. Word of mouth and rumours from those who had succeeded across the ocean made America seem like the kind of place where even the poorest families could make a new life. In Sicily, tales of men who had become successful in factories, farms, and construction sites reached the ears of many, spreading a belief that a better life awaited in the New World. Between 1906 and 1914, over 1 million Italians made the perilous journey across the Atlantic. The promise of a better future in America was too powerful to ignore, even though the journey itself was fraught with difficulty and uncertainty. 6 of the Genna brothers, Antonio, Mike, Vincenzo, Pietro, Salvatore, and Angelo, all left Sicily between 1910 and 1914, along with their parents and sisters. Only Nicola Genna, the youngest, stayed behind in Marsala with his aunt. The second youngest of the brothers, Angelo, was the last to make the journey, boarding the SS Venezia in 1914, a ship that regularly made the passage from Palermo to New York Harbour. The transatlantic voyage itself was grueling, lasting anywhere from 40 to 90 days, depending on the weather and delays. Like many immigrants of their time, the Genna brothers travelled in steerage, the lowest and most cramped part of the ship, where unsanitary conditions and disease were rampant. But for the Gennas, it was the only option available to them. When they finally arrived in New York, the sight of American soil was a welcome relief. The long, grueling voyage had taken a heavy toll, but the promise of a new life was now within reach. The Genna brothers disembarked and made their way to Ellis Island, the busiest immigrant inspection and processing station in the United States at the time. For many new arrivals, this was the first taste of the American system, a cold, bureaucratic inspection that involved lengthy waits, medical examinations, and interrogations. As they stood in line, often for hours, their fates hung in the balance. Were they healthy enough to enter the country? Were their papers in order? Would they be sent back or allowed to begin their new life? The process could take up to 8 days, and each person had to endure a series of rigorous inspections. Only those deemed fit to work were allowed entry. Once through the inspection, they were free to continue their journey, but the experience was far from a smooth transition. They had crossed the ocean to the land of opportunity, but the harsh reality of being poor, working-class immigrants in a foreign country set in quickly. From Ellis Island, the Genna family made their way to Chicago, settling in the city's Little Italy neighborhood, a haven for newly arrived Sicilian immigrants where they could find familiar faces and build a community in the unfamiliar American landscape. The family settled at 750 Taylor Street, a 3-story townhouse. By 1914, all 6 brothers were settled in Chicago, eager to carve out a future in the land of opportunity. In Chicago, the Genna brothers wasted little time. Though they had arrived as poor, hard-working peasants, the Genna brothers soon found themselves entangled in Chicago's illicit world. Like many major cities of the time, Chicago was rife with opportunities for those willing to bend the law. One of the first groups they encountered was the Black Hand, an unorganized extortion gang that preyed on fresh Italian immigrants. This criminal organization, composed of other Italian Americans, was already established in Chicago and posed an immediate threat to the new arrivals. But rather than cower, the Gennas saw this as a chance to assert themselves. The brothers, not interested in being labourers or farmhands as they had led the inspectors to believe on their Ellis Island documents, began throwing their weight around. Antonio, standing at 5'6", was the tallest of the brothers, meaning they were no brutes in brawls. But he and his brothers were soon well armed, carrying clubs, ice picks and even knives to defend themselves. Going from potential prey, they began collaborating with the Black Hand, initially running small illegal rackets such as gambling dens and loan sharking. Their work made them indispensable to the group, and by 1919, they were roughing up labour unions on behalf of the Black Hand's interests. However, the Black Hand was not the true power in Chicago's criminal world. That lay with the Unione Siciliana, an Italian-American fraternal organisation that, while initially focused on supporting Sicilian immigrants, had slowly morphed into a powerful criminal syndicate. The Unione was founded in the late 19th century and was a predecessor of the modern mafia as we know it today. It consisted of the most influential Italians in Chicago and their corrupt friends, including Big Jim Colosimo, the city's most powerful gangster, Harry Cullett, a crooked policeman who distributed bribes for the Unione around the Chicago Police Department, and Labour leader and political fixer Mike Merlo. While the Unione presented itself as a benevolent institution, its true influence was as a criminal enterprise, which controlled key sectors of Chicago's economy. It was through the Black Hand that the Unione Siciliana extended its reach, using extortion and intimidation to dominate local businesses and enforce its will across the city, whilst maintaining a clean public profile to Italian immigrants in order to influence their votes, thus making the Unione indispensable to corrupt mayors, of which Chicago had a whole host of in the early 20th century. At the helm of the Unione was its president, Anthony D'Andrea, who had been president since 1915. The labour unions that the brothers were now intimidating and infiltrating were vital to D'Andrea and the Unione's influence, as they provided a way to exert control over the city's workforce. Through their control over union leadership, the Unione was able to influence strikes, control hiring practices, and force businesses to comply with their terms. This gave them immense power within the city's industries, allowing them to extort both employers and workers, and the Black Hand was a major component of enforcing their power. The Black Hand's methods were simple but effective. They sent threatening letters, often accompanied by a black handprint, demanding protection money from businesses, hence the gang's nickname. In exchange, they promised to safeguard these establishments from destruction or violence. As the Gennas contributed to carrying out the Black Hand's brutal tasks, the Unione's hold on the city was solidified, with the Black Hand using fear to assert dominance across Chicago. Their ruthlessness and savvy in navigating the needs of the Sicilian diaspora helped the Genna Brothers rise swiftly within Chicago's criminal world. Blending violence, intelligence, and ambition, the Gennas soon became synonymous with power. As they began exerting control over American labor unions, the brothers realized that adopting Americanized versions of their names would help them blend in and further their operations. For the three eldest brothers, Vincenzo, Pietro, and Salvatore, this adaptation became necessary. They found that their American counterparts struggled to pronounce their names, and so they adjusted. Pietro became Peter, Vincenzo went by Jim, and Salvatore shortened his name to Sam. These simpler names allowed them to gain trust, communicate more effectively, and build crucial connections, all whilst continuing to impress Anthony D'Andrea and the leadership of the Unione Siciliana. In 1916, D'Andrea officially hired the Genna brothers as political sluggers for his campaign for running for alderman. Their tasks were clear and brutal, working in the back rooms to stuff ballot boxes, intimidating voters at polling stations, and even storming city council chambers when necessary. The brothers thrived in this chaotic world of street-level political warfare, and their loyalty and effectiveness did not go unnoticed. For the three youngest brothers, their nicknames were not chosen for convenience, but earned through reputation and action carrying out D'Andrea's will around this time. Angelo, the youngest, quickly earned the moniker of Bloody Angelo for his no-holds-barred approach to violence. He had no qualms about breaking a voter's legs outside a polling station for merely suggesting that they wouldn't vote for D'Andrea. Mike, known for his volatile temper and explosive outbursts, soon became feared across Chicago's underworld as Mike the Devil. Together, Bloody Angelo and Mike the Devil served as the gang's primary enforcers, handling the bloodier, messier tasks with terrifying efficiency. Meanwhile, Antonio carved out a different role. Calm, rational and calculating, he often acted as the diplomat of the family. He handled negotiations with union leaders, businessmen and other mobsters with polished professionalism, only turning to violence when absolutely necessary. When words failed, Antonio would quietly dispatch Angelo and Mike to settle lingering issues, a strategy that earned him the nickname of the Gentleman. Sam became the political fixer of the family, working as the go-between for the Unione Siciliana, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement. With his influence, Sam ensured that the brothers' criminal activities were shielded from police interference. To solidify their position, the Gennas opened a headquarters in the form of Sam's billiard hall at 856 Blue Island Avenue, where their operations expanded further. With their new base of operations, they grew into one of the most formidable criminal forces in Chicago. Peter and Jim were versatile, able to help with the violence when needed, but also capable of using their calm-headed approach to negotiate with unions and the Unione. The brothers worked together, each with their unique skill sets, to dominate the city's underworld. Whilst carrying out D'Andrea's will, the brothers collectively earned the nickname of the Terrible Gennas in the headlines of Chicago's newspapers, whilst most of Little Italy's residents referred to them as the Kings of Taylor Street. No matter the moniker, the brothers had become untouchable, their power bolstered by a vast network of corrupt politicians and their strong connections with D'Andrea and the Unione, meaning they were free to carry out their dirty work with impunity. But as the 1920s got underway, an opportunity arose. one which would propel them to become one of the richest, most dangerous and influential crime families in Chicago. This moment would mark the beginning of a legacy defined by power, violence, betrayal, and bloodshed. At the stroke of midnight on January the 16th, 1920, the United States officially plunged into the Prohibition era. The 18th Amendment, as Prohibition was officially known, outlawed the production, sale and transportation of alcohol, sent shockwaves through American society. But for the Gennas, it wasn't a setback, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The brothers immediately recognised Prohibition for what it truly was, a chance to tap into an underworld river of wealth. They understood one simple truth: Americans weren't going to give up drinking just because the government said so. If anything, the public's thirst for alcohol only grew stronger as the law tried to outlaw booze. Secret bars and underground clubs called speakeasies sprang up by the thousands. In Chicago alone, there were an estimated 3,000 speakeasies, roughly one for every 900 residents of Chicago's 2.7 million population in 1920, meaning Chicagoans kept their insatiable thirst. That insatiable thirst meant one thing: massive opportunity for those daring enough to keep the taps flowing. And the Gennas, already seasoned in the art of the underworld, were ready to lead the charge. The brothers gradually stepped back from their role as enforcers for the Unione and shifted their focus towards building a liquor empire. Their ambition wasn't just profit, they aimed to someday stand as equals with the top dogs in the Unione's leadership, and eventually take a seat at the helm themselves. In February 1920, just a few weeks into Prohibition, the Gennas obtained government licenses for industrial alcohol through the Unione's corrupt web. This allowed them to purchase industrial alcohol from the government stores. Legally designated for industrial use and poisoned with deadly additives like wood alcohol to prevent anyone drinking it, the brothers ignored the risks and only minimally filtered it and redistilled it before flavouring it and selling it as whiskey. While other Chicago gangs scrambled to organise fleets of trucks and rum-running routes, smuggling premium whiskey and beer from Canada, where Prohibition was not the law, the Gennas chose a different strategy. They focused on producing cheap, strong, gut rot brewed locally. They built a distilling operation in the basements, tenements and attics of Little Italy, the neighbourhood they ruled, with an iron grip. Recognising the risk of operating large centralised distilleries, they devised a decentralised system. They hired newly arrived Italian immigrants to operate homemade stills in individual apartments, minimising the damage that a police raid could cause to their overall operation. Many of these makeshift stills were death traps. Accidents were common, with explosions sending metal shrapnel and fire through the tenement buildings. Deaths were common, yet some workers still took the job willingly, lured by the promise of $15 a day, around $250 in today's money, a fortune compared to honest labour. Others were forced into it, repaying debts owed to the Gennas. By mid-1920, the Gennas operated over 100 stills across Little Italy. A single home still typically produced 350 gallons of alcohol each week at a cost of 50 to 75 cents a gallon. The Gennas sold their product for $6 a gallon, generating a staggering $200,000 a month, equivalent to roughly $3 million today. Despite the liquor's dangers, it could cause blindness, paralysis or death, it remained in high demand, and the Gennas expanded their reach beyond Little Italy, tapping into Southside markets. With so much money pouring in, the threat of attacks from rival gangs grew, and the Gennas quickly reorganised their operation to protect their embryonic empire. Sam Genna stepped up as the business manager. Jim and Pete oversaw the bootlegging operations, managing stills and making sure deliveries flowed to the speakeasies that they supplied on time. Bloody Angelo and Mike the Devil took charge of enforcement, specialising in intimidation and murder. Tony the Gentleman acted as an advisor, rarely dirtying his own hands. To fortify their muscle, the Gennas recruited ruthless killers. Among them was a notorious hitman Samut Amatuna, feared enforcer Giuseppe the Cavalier Spano, a nickname earned from his lack of fear in gunfights, and the Sicilian inseparable assassins John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. Men so superstitious that they smeared garlic on their bullets, believing it would cause gangrene if a victim survived their initial gunshots. The Gennas were now a full-fledged, Sicilian-only criminal army that was ready for war if necessary. Away from their dealings with labour union leaders, they spoke only in Sicilian, meaning their operation was watertight, locking out any outsiders. But their growing strength did not go unnoticed by rival gangs across Chicago's fragmented landscape. Chicago, in the early Prohibition years, was a city divided. The Gennas, with support from the Unione Siciliana, ruled Little Italy. Big Jim Colosimo and his underboss Johnny Torrio controlled the Loop, where most speakeasies were located, and most of the South Side. The charismatic Deanie O'Banion led the Irish Northside gang. Spike O'Donnell held the far South Side, while Klondike O'Donnell, no relation to Spike, commanded the far West Side. Terry Druggan and Frankie Lake operated in the near West Side. Joe Saltis and Madman McCurlane managed the Stockyards district, and Roger Toohey reigned over the far suburbs. These gangs were no strangers to violence. But for the first few years of Prohibition, Chicago's bloodiest moment came not from turf wars, but from internal betrayal. Big Jim Colosimo, the city's reigning kingpin, refused to enter the bootlegging business, even as he watched rival gangs grow wealthy overnight. Johnny Torrio, his trusted lieutenant, pushed him relentlessly to reconsider, but Colosimo was content with his empire of brothels, gambling dens, and Colosimo's Cafe, a nationally famous hotspot located at 216 South Wabash Avenue. His operations raked in more than $50,000 a month, around $720,000 today, a huge figure, yes, but dwarfed by the profits now being made in illegal liquor. Torrio, a former enforcer from Brooklyn's infamous 5 Points gang, had come to Chicago in 1909 at Colosimo's behest to help fend off Black Hand extortionists, targeting his gambling dens and brothels, the same Black Hand extortionists that the Gennas would have fallen victim to if they hadn't decided to join them. Family ties bound both Colosimo and Torrio, as Colosimo had married Torrio's aunt, Victoria Moresco. It was those same gambling dens and brothels that the Black Hand extortionists were targeting that Colosimo was now content with. He ran over 200 brothels and around 30 gambling dens in his territory. Whilst it netted him $720,000 a month in today's money, that wasn't even a quarter of the Gennas' $3 million monthly from the booze business, and Johnny Torrio was well aware of this. Torrio and his right-hand man, Al Capone, also from Brooklyn, frequently met with their boss Colosimo at the Four Juices, their Southside headquarters, located at 2222 South Wabash Avenue, hence the nickname the Four Juices, located right next door to Colosimo's Cafe. Again and again, they urged him to embrace bootlegging, but he kept refusing, reluctant to invite new enemies or change a system that had already made him rich. Personal issues further complicated matters. Colosimo had recently started an affair with a young singer from his cafe named Dale Winter, which broke Victoria's heart. In March 1920, Colosimo finalised a divorce from Victoria and married Dale Winter in West Baden Springs, Indiana, an action that may have loosened any lingering family loyalty that Torrio felt towards his boss. With the backing of D'Andrea and the rest of the Unione Siciliana, Torrio made his decision. On May the 11th, 1920, Colosimo was lured to his cafe to meet an unknown associate. Minutes after stepping inside, he was ambushed and shot dead by a lone gunman hiding in his cloakroom. A single bullet entered Colosimo's brain behind his right ear. Frankie Yale, another Brooklyner, travelled from New York at the request of Capone and Torrio to carry out the hit. They wanted someone from outside the city who would not be recognised by the police or by any of the Southsiders themselves. Although suspected by Chicago police at the time, Frankie Yale was never officially charged, with the Unione and the corrupt officers on their payroll having a part to play in the cover-up. Following Colosimo's funeral, Johnny Torrio's ambitions quickly became clear. Wasting no time, he expanded his operations and dove headfirst into the bootlegging business. Within just 2 years, Torrio's territory stretched westward from his Four Juices Club headquarters in the Levee District, also known as the Red Light District, to the suburbs of Forest View, and southward from the Loop all the way to the Indiana border, a vast empire now under his control.
Torrio was a master strategist, rising to dominance through calculated moves and shrewd alliances. He knew how to position his forces, how to reinvest his profits, and how to manipulate political and criminal relationships to his advantage. Torrio was the first gangster to run his empire like a corporation, creating a model that would influence organised crime for generations to come. Al Capone served as his enforcer, ensuring that agreements were honoured and rivals stayed in line. Fiercely loyal to Torrio, Capone had proven himself through acts of violence, including his alleged role in Jim Colosimo's assassination. Known for his sharp dress sense and the powder he used to lighten the prominent scar on his cheek, a souvenir from a bar fight when he worked as a bouncer in Brooklyn, Capone operated under the alias as Al Brown, used furniture dealer.
Torrio and the Gennas soon forged a lucrative alliance. The Gennas supplied Torrio and Capone with sugar for manufacturing corn liquor, whilst the Southsiders reciprocated the relationship by providing the Gennas with booze to sell whenever their stocks were running dry. Recognising the dangers of unchecked competition, Torrio took things a step further by founding a booze cartel. Having seen firsthand how early beer wars between the likes of Dutch Schultz, Frank Costello and Legs Diamond had torn apart New York's underworld, Torrio had made it his mission to keep Chicago peaceful. His philosophy was simple: peace meant profits. Appointing himself as the city's chief peacekeeper, Torrio spent late 1920 brokering alliances across Chicago's criminal factions. His pitch was always the same: there's enough dough to go around for all of us, and killing ain't necessary. Whilst New York descended into bloodshed, Chicago operated as a unified syndicate. The North and Southsiders regularly loaned each other trucks when needed. The Gennas provided sugar and booze, or sometimes received it in return. Smaller factions like Madman McCurlane and Joe Saltus's crew also pitched in, supplying liquor if Torrio and Capone's clubs were running dry, or lending money to help someone like Spike O'Donnell open a new brewery. Each faction controlled its own stills and breweries, but Torrio and Capone's operation, controlling the Loop, was by far the largest and the most profitable. Torrio had become the unofficial king of Chicago's underworld, maintaining a delicate peace among the city's gangs and dividing up the territory and borders at a pivotal meeting. The Gennas were happy with Torrio's clearly defined Little Italy borders, the Chicago River to the east, Kinsey Street to the north, Kedzie Avenue to the west, and Roosevelt Road to the south. They were to stay in this territory, and for the first few years of Prohibition, everything ran smoothly in Chicago. It wasn't until the youngest of the Genna Brothers on American soil, Bloody Angelo, began pushing his liquor beyond Little Italy's borders that the fragile cartel Torrio had built would be tested like never before. But before that storm could break, the Gennas had another, more immediate war to fight, one which was much closer to home. Before Bloody Angelo Genna could ignite a citywide bloodbath, the Gennas found themselves pulled into a brutal conflict, a savage political war that would plunge Little Italy into chaos long before Chicago's bootlegging wars had a chance to take place. This was the Aldermen's War, a vicious, bloody struggle between two powerful factions: Irish-American political boss Johnny DePau Powers, an Italian-American challenger and head of the Unione Siciliana, Anthony D'Andrea. From 1916 to 1921, the battle for control of Chicago's bloody 19th Ward would leave over 30 men dead, as bombings, shootings and street warfare turned the district into a battlefield. Johnny Powers, a longtime saloon keeper and entrenched political boss, had ruled the 19th Ward since the 1880s. His power was built on old-school machine politics, trading favours for votes, offering political protection to criminals, and overseeing the vice districts that kept the underworld thriving. Despite a massive influx of Italian immigrants into Little Italy over the decades, Powers, an Irishman, held onto his throne with an iron grip. But resentment simmered among the growing Italian-American population who longed for leadership of their own. That resentment found a voice in Anthony D'Andrea, a complex and controversial figure. Although he had once been an ordained priest, D'Andrea had turned to crime, serving 13 months in prison for his role in a national counterfeiting ring. Despite heading the Unione Siciliana and staying active in the underworld, D'Andrea successfully rebuilt his image as a labour leader and a community organiser. To many Italians in the 19th Ward, he represented pride, strength and self-rule, a chance to finally break free from the Irish political domination. In 1916, D'Andrea challenged Powers by running for alderman against Powers' loyal ally, junior alderman James Bowler. This was a time where you had two aldermen to award. The Chicago Tribune was blunt about D'Andrea's reputation. Anthony D'Andrea is an unfrocked priest, linguist and former power in the old red light district, who, in 1903, was released from the penitentiary after serving 13 months on a counterfeiting charge. D'Andrea's name has also been connected with a gang of Italian forgers and bank thieves who operated at one time all over the country. And perhaps those reports about D'Andrea were right.
The first blood of the Alderman Wars was spilled in February 1916 when Frank Lombardi, a Powers loyalist and ward healer, was gunned down outside a saloon by 17-year-old Genna hitman Samuzzo Samuz Amatuna. As a result of this, both gangs began hiring election sluggers, gangs of hired muscle used to intimidate voters, attack polling stations and terrorise the opposition. D'Andrea hired the Gennas, and Powers had an Irish and Italian gang of his own who were also not afraid to pull the trigger.
Street fights, shootings and even bombings became commonplace. A grim ritual also emerged. At 725 South Loomis Street, names of future targets of both sides were carved into the bark of a poplar tree, a place that soon became known as Dead Man's Tree. If your name appeared on the tree, your days were numbered. Although DeAndrea lost the 1916 election and again in 1919, the violence only escalated. DeAndrea refused to back down. His political ambitions burned hotter than ever, and he had the muscle to back them up. In 1921, his wealth had increased from the nationwide bootlegging spoils, with all the gangs in the city coughing up to the Unione. DeAndrea ramped up his political ambitions and asked the Gennas to put their focus back on his ambitions. Now their bootlegging operation was running seamlessly. The brothers agreed, and they were now once again operating as gunmen for both DeAndrea and the Unione Siciliana, serving as his personal enforcers, committing the bombings, murders and intimidations that plunged the 19th Ward into terror. They weren't just gangsters anymore, they were now political assassins, operating with the blessing of Chicago's most powerful Italian-American organization. Whenever a power's supporter needed to be eliminated, the Gennas pulled the trigger. Whenever a hall owner refused to rent space to DeAndrea's campaign, the Gennas made sure they were bombed or threatened into compliance. In the first 3 months of 1921 alone, Power's home was bombed, DeAndrea's campaign headquarters was bombed, and a DeAndrea political rally was attacked with a bomb, injuring 5 people. The old Power's political machine in Chicago was cracking, and the Genna Brothers were at the heart of its collapse. By early 1921, the 19th Ward had become a battleground of bombings, shootings, and intimidation. In March, the Gennas delivered 2 devastating blows in a single, bloody day that would shake the ward to its core. It began with the murder of Paul Labriola, a court clerk, Power's loyalist, and key precinct captain. Labriola was a crucial figure in maintaining Irish control over the ward, and he knew the dangers. His name had already been carved into the ominous dead man's tree weeks earlier, meaning that the brothers had marked him for death. On May the 6th, 1921, Labriola left his home on West Congress Street and walked west towards Halstead Street, unaware of the ambush that was now waiting for him. He had been receiving disturbing phone calls and threatening letters since the election that DeAndrea lost, but like many in the gritty world of Chicago politics, he dismissed them as part of the usual electoral machinations. Just a few days before, he had dined with the victorious Alderman Powers and looked forward to reaping the rewards of the political spoils. As Labriola walked only 50 feet from his front door, he encountered 2 men coming round the corner, Bloody Angelo and Mike the Devil. Labriola recognised the brothers immediately, and words were exchanged. Before he could react, 3 more men appeared behind him: Samut Samatuna, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi. Without warning, the air was filled with the sharp crack of heavy caliber pistols as the 5 men opened fire, the bullets tearing into Labriola's body. As Labriola collapsed to the ground, Bloody Angelo Genna stood over his already lifeless body and fired 3 more gratuitous shots into his head. The execution was swift, brutal, and relentless, a chilling reminder of the power that the Genna brothers now wielded in the city. But for May the 6th, the Gennas were still not done. Later that very same day, they struck again, this time targeting Harry Raimondi, a cigar store owner and former DeAndrea supporter who had recently defected to Johnny Powers' camp. Raimondi, once a friend to the Sicilians, had made the fatal mistake of switching allegiances. The Gennas, operating with cold efficiency, walked into his shop in broad daylight and hit him with 9 bullets, again with 3 to the head. The message was brutally clear. In the bloody 19th Ward, loyalty was enforced at gunpoint and betrayal meant death. Public outrage exploded following the twin murders. Powers' camp, desperate to stem the bloodshed and retain some semblance of control, publicly denounced the violence. James Bowler, a key Powers ally, issued a desperate statement to the press. Conditions in the 19th ward are terrible, he said. Gunmen are patrolling the streets. I have received threats that I was to be bumped off or kidnapped. Fear gripped the neighbourhood. Voters stayed home. Businesses boarded up their windows, and the ward's reputation as the Bloody 19th spread like wildfire throughout Chicago. Despite the mounting backlash and heat from the authorities, Angelo and Mike Genna were not the type to back down. They continued in their assault, and shortly after came the death of handsome Joe Lanus, a millionaire who owned a successful automobile sales company and was a public financial backer of Alderman Powers. There are no surviving photographs of Lanus, but he was well known in both political and underworld circles. On May the 8th, just 2 days after the double killings, he was found dead inside his own sales room. 3 bullets to the back of the head, Bloody Angelo's trademark send-off. No struggle, no signs of robbery. It was a clean professional hit, pure and simple. But for every move the Gennas made, Powers struck back. Soon after, one of Angelo Genna's closest friends, Nicola Maggio, was murdered by Powers' men. Like Lanus, no photographs of Maggio survived, but his death hit Angelo hard. Maggio wasn't just an associate, he was like family. The killing lit a fuse in Angelo that burned white hot with vengeance. A week later, Angelo got word about who was responsible. A man named Paul Knott, a saloon keeper in the stockyards, had been fingered. Knott was no saint. He was known to be a hired gun for the Powers machine and was suspected of pulling the trigger in Maggio's murder.
He lived just a half block from his saloon, and one night as he stepped outside and started walking to work, as his wife and expecting child were watching, a short, stocky man appeared. A few words were exchanged, then, without warning, the man pulled a revolver and fired 5 shots into Paul Knott, dropping him in the street. With Knott's family watching, the short, stocky man couldn't risk getting close enough to his body to fire 3 shots into his skull, his signature calling card, and therefore he disappeared into the night.
Knott was rushed to the hospital, bleeding out but still clinging to life. There, Detective Edward Murphy of the Chicago Police Department questioned him. "You know who shot you?" Murphy asked. "You know who shot me," Knott croaked back. "No, I don't, Paul. Who was it?" "The youngest one of those 3 brothers who run the pool room on Taylor Street." "Genna?" "I don't know the name," Knott replied. Lieutenant Murphy wasted no time. He raced straight to the Genna pool room headquarters on Taylor Street. Inside, he found Angelo and arrested him on the spot. Murphy dragged him straight to Knott's hospital bedside. There, in a tense room crowded with doctors, nurses, police officers, and Knott's own family, Paul Knott took one last look and identified his shooter. "That's him," he said, nodding towards Angelo Genna. Not long after, Knott died from his wounds. The fallout was immediate. Angelo's brothers, Peter and Jim, were also rounded up, but with no solid evidence against them, it was Angelo alone who faced trial on murder charges. But this time, the defense played a smart hand. Angelo's lawyer grilled the attending physicians on the witness stand. Had not been given any sedatives or morphine before he died? Yes. Could those drugs have impaired his memory or clouded his ability to identify someone correctly? The doctors had to admit it was possible. With that, the prosecution's case crumbled. The judge dismissed the charges and Angelo Genna walked free. Despite his main henchman now back on the streets, the violence had spiraled beyond even Anthony DeAndrea's control. On May the 12th, 1921, 4 days after the murder of Paul Knott, DeAndrea himself became a target. Late that evening, as DeAndrea returned to his home at 917 South Ashland Avenue, he climbed the familiar steps to his porch, unaware that assassins were lurking in the shadows. As he reached his door, the gunmen struck. They unleashed hail of bullets, riddling DeAndrea's body before melting back into the night. Mortally wounded, DeAndrea staggered inside, collapsing into the arms of his horrified wife. Moments later, the man who had nearly toppled the Irish political machine with blood and ambition died in his own kitchen.
DeAndrea's assassination sent shockwaves through Little Italy. His funeral was a public spectacle, drawing thousands of mourners who packed the streets in a display of both grief and fierce ethnic pride. Lavish floral arrangements surrounded his casket, many bearing messages like "Martyr for the Italian cause." To the Italian community, DeAndrea was not a gangster or a criminal. He was a fallen hero, a symbol of resistance against an Irish-dominated political system that had long marginalised them.
The bloodshed in the 19th Ward, however, did not end with DeAndrea's death. In the aftermath of his assassination, powers continued applying pressure on the DeAndrea party, and the violence continued to escalate. Just 10 days later, Michael Licari, a loyal DeAndrea supporter, was gunned down. The following month, Joseph Laspisa, DeAndrea's trusted bodyguard and the driver on the night of his death, was murdered while driving down Oak Street in Little Sicily, near the notorious Death Corner. A backseat passenger of another car opened fire, cutting down Laspisa in cold blood. These murders were only a fraction of the growing toll of the conflict. Over 30 killings were attributed to the bloody feud between Powers' faction and DeAndrea's followers, though, like DeAndrea's own murder, most remained unsolved. But the violence did not only claim lives, it also shattered the political aspirations of Little Italy's Italian community. With DeAndrea's death, the dream of electing an Italian alderman to represent the 19th Ward came to an abrupt end. In July 1921, under pressure from Alderman Powers, the 19th Ward was redrawn, effectively splitting it into parts of the 20th, 25th, 26th and 27th Wards, none of which had an Italian majority. The political influence that the Italians fought so hard to build was now fractured. In the wake of DeAndrea's assassination, Mike Merlo was swiftly elected as the new head of the Unione Siciliana. Merlo was a different kind of leader, a man who believed in peace and was already well established within Chicago's Democratic Party. Unlike DeAndrea, Merlo did not rely on the volatile power struggles within the city's underworld for votes or political leverage. With Merlo at the helm and his close friend Johnny Torrio acting as an unofficial peacekeeper, calm was restored in Chicago. The various factions within the Italian community began to prosper once more under Merlo's leadership. As 1922 and 1923 passed, life for the terrible Gennas was bliss. They were filthy rich, each brother easily a millionaire. They were quite literally untouchable under the watchful eyes of Mike Merlo, who kept the police off the Gennas' backs as long as the Gennas kept up with their payroll payments to the feds and their dues to the Unione. Speaking of which, they were now at the table of the Unione as equals and no longer carrying out their biddings for the committee. Johnny Torrio's bootlegging cartel ensured that all rival gangs stayed off their patch, and despite their father Antonino passing away in 1922, the beginning of the Roaring Twenties couldn't have gotten better for them. It was like you've seen in the movies: fast cars, bags of cash, and all the power that they wanted. They walked down Taylor Street daily like kings without crowns. With their excessive wealth, they expanded their interests, and as we can see from this 1923 Chicago telephone directory, they bought several more homes and establishments. Jim is now listed as the owner of 2 coffee shops, which were actually speakeasies, at 1022 Taylor Street in the heart of Little Italy and at 854 Blue Island Avenue, which is the building next door to the billiard hall headquarters of the gang, located at 856. Also on the telephone directory is a property under Sam's name at 1119 Blue Island Avenue, which was the gang's main warehouse and the location of their biggest still. They were paying off Chicago police and the handful of Prohibition agents in the city around $12,000 a week in bribes to leave their warehouse alone, around $200,000 a week today. They had 6 full-time staff manning the stills and churned out around 3,000 gallons of their gut-rot moonshine alone just from this location. Jim is also listed as living at 925 Lakeside Place, a luxurious uptown property which still stands today. It's also the location where the famous family photo was taken. Mike, Sam and Peter all still lived with their mother and 2 sisters at 750 West Taylor Street, whilst the most famous and feared of the brothers for his newspaper coverage during the Alderman Wars, Bloody Angelo, rented a luxury penthouse in the Belmont Hotel on the corner of Belmont Avenue and Sheridan Road. Antonio the gentleman bought an 8-bedroom and 3-bathroom apartment at 5556 South Troy Avenue, further south, with his wife. Each of the Genna brothers was thriving, indulging in the luxuries of the roaring 20s and living life to the fullest. But for some reason, possibly boredom, probably a lust for violence, Bloody Angelo decided to bring all that crashing down. As the 2 biggest gangs in Chicago, the Southsiders and the Northsiders, strengthened their partnership and set their sights on expanding into Cicero, a nearby suburb of Chicago, tensions began to rise. Cicero had been an unassuming part of the city, but it was rapidly transforming. Johnny Torrio and Al Capone saw an opportunity to relocate their operations there, away from the growing reform movement in Chicago politics. With the local government more susceptible to bribery, Cicero quickly became a hotbed of illegal activity.
A donation from Capone.
The once quiet suburb turned into a bustling district filled with gambling, drinking, and jazz. Torrio placed Al Capone in charge of the Cicero operation, where he set up their headquarters at the renowned Hawthorne Hotel.
The local police turned a blind eye, knowing full well the consequences of opposing Capone. However, as the reform movement began gaining momentum, Capone and Torrio found themselves facing increased opposition. The Democrats aimed to unseat the Republican mayor of Cicero, Joseph Klenner, who was known for his willingness to tolerate the mob's activities. In an effort to protect their interests, Torrio and Capone took drastic steps to ensure the stability of their operations in Cicero.
Election Day, April 1st, 1924, became a day of intimidation and violence. Nearly 250 gangsters descended on Cicero, including men sent by Dini O'Banion, the head of the Northsiders and a key figure in the truce between the Irish North and the Italian Southsides. Armed with Thompson submachine guns and baseball bats, the gangsters made their presence known. Their sole objective was to make sure that the right votes were cast and the right people stayed in power. Those who dared to oppose the mob were abducted or murdered, their bodies discarded with little care. The chaos continued as gangsters stuffed ballots for the pro-mob candidate and took control of the election process. By the time Chicago's mayor, William Deaver, sent detectives to Cicero to investigate, the damage had been done. But despite the victory, there was a price to pay. Al Capone's brother, Frank, was killed in a gunfight with the detectives. Frank had mistakenly fired at the lawmen, believing they were rival gangsters, and paid the ultimate price for his mistake. In spite of Frank Capone's death, tensions within the mob were far from over. Dini, who had contributed heavily to the election, soon demanded compensation for his support. Torrio, seeking to keep the peace, reluctantly agreed, granting Dini a portion of Cicero's lucrative beer distribution rights. However, this decision had long-term repercussions. Dini, emboldened by his own success, began expanding his operations even further, opening up his speakeasies in Cicero without Torrio's blessing. Dini was no stranger to controversy. Known for his sharp tongue and pranks, he was a natural troublemaker. His favourite pastime seemed to be insulting the Italians he now held a fragile truce with, in particular Al Capone, who he openly mocked, calling him the behemoth due to his podgy size.
He had a disliking for Italians and wasn't afraid to express it. Dini's insults were legendary, and his tendency to publicly ridicule Italian figures in the underworld created a brewing storm of resentment. His remarks about the Italian mafia's heritage were not just insults, it was a personal attack on everything they held so dear. It was this consistent barrage of humiliation that began to wear on the patience of the Gennas, in particular Bloody Angelo and Mike the Devil, who already had a particular disdain for the Irish after the Alderman's War. They decided they would no longer tolerate Dini's mockery and wanted to banish Chicago of the Irishman.
Angelo muscled in on Northsider territory, pushing the Genna's homemade moonshine onto speakeasy owners at a cheaper price than O'Banion's hooch and demanded their loyalty. Peter and Antonio didn't want to start a gang war, but the remaining brothers, Mike the Devil, Sam and Jim, all agreed that Dini and his Northside gang was there for the taking and encouraged Angelo. Mike and Bloody Angelo began paying visits to Northsider speakeasies on North Halstead Street. The process was simple. They'd enter the establishment, make themselves known, order a beer at the bar, declare it disgusting and unfit for consumption, usually spit it back in the speakeasy owner's face, and then tell him he's now buying beer from the Gennas.
I'm not buying any.
If the speakeasy owner didn't start buying from them, they'd come back and burn the place down with him still in it, chained to his bar. The reputations of the two most violent brothers of the terrible Gennas meant that the speakeasy owner had no other option but to comply. Dini, instead of threatening the speakeasy owner to resume buying his beer again, would then travel down to Little Italy and mirror the process, taking one of the Genna speakeasies in the same fashion. The violence escalated further when Angelo and Mike began hijacking Dini's shipments, raiding Northside warehouses, and even attacked two truck drivers dropping off a shipment at one of the newly seized Northside speakeasies in Little Italy. Both gangs were testing each other's patience, and Torrio, wanting to prevent the situation from spiralling out of control, stepped in. He called a peace meeting with both Dini and the Gennas. Sam and Antonio, the more level-headed of the brothers, attended on behalf of the gang, yet the meeting was still tense, with Dini refusing to back down. He said that the Gennas had started this and that they should relinquish some of their territory to the Northsiders as a lesson. After calling Capone, Torrio and the two Genna brothers lousy wops, the Irishman stormed out of the meeting. The Northsiders, frustrated by the Genna's continued aggression, retaliated further. They began hijacking the Genna's liquor shipments, intensifying the cycle of violence. Torrio, who tolerated Dini to avoid gang war, but was natural allies and actual friends with his fellow Italian compatriots, the Gennas, was desperate to avoid an all-out gang war and turned to Mike Merlo to seek permission to sanction a hit on Dini.
Mike Merlo, a man of considerable influence on the North Side, had been the recipient of hefty payments from the Northsiders' political machine, who too benefited from having Mike Merlo in charge. Taking out O'Banion would be disastrous for his pocketbook, and not to mention would likely spark a bloody gang war, something that Merlo, a pragmatic businessman, could not afford. As a result, Dini O'Banion lived to see another day, much to the annoyance of Johnny Torrio and the Genna Brothers. As the year turned, Dini became increasingly bold, understanding that the Gennas, protected from the law by Mike Merlo, would not dare act against him as long as Mike remained in control. By February 1924, Dini decided to turn things up a notch, orchestrating a brazen plan which attempted to frame the Southsider boss, Johnny Torrio, and one which could land him in prison.
Dini, still a young man at 31, surprisingly claimed he wanted out of the rackets. He told Torrio that he planned to sell his stake in the Seiburn brewery, the centrepiece of his bootlegging empire and one that Torrio and Dini co-owned, to retire to the country with his wife. He offered Torrio the chance to buy him out for $500,000, around $9 million today, an absolutely staggering sum. Torrio, eager to remove a rival and thinking that the North Side would collapse and be there for the taking without Dini's leadership, eagerly agreed. The deal seemed to promise peace and an end to Dini's confrontations with the Gennas. On the morning of May the 19th, 1924, Dini invited Torrio to inspect the brewery. As Torrio arrived, he was greeted with what seemed like a legitimate business deal. Dini proudly showed him around the operation, pointing out the barrels of booze ready to be transported that morning. As the last truckload of goods was loaded, the moment of betrayal came. Police, led by Chief Morgan Collins, blocked all exits. Torrio, in a panic, was arrested, and so was Dini. The arrest was not as disastrous for Dini as it was for Torrio, who had already been arrested once for a bootlegging charge, meaning this second arrest would likely result in jail time for the boss of the Southsiders. Dini was able to pay his $7,500 bail without hesitation and appeared almost giddy in the courtroom, whistling as he waited to be summoned. However, the story took a darker twist. Johnny Torrio soon learned from an informant that Dini had known about the raid in advance. Dini had tipped off the police to ensure Torrio's arrest, planning to frame him while securing his own safety. Dini's gloating about the raid sent ripples through the North Side. He bragged to friends about how he had rubbed that schmuck's face in the dirt, referring to Torrio, and mocking the Southside Italian bosses. Even Mike Merlo was offended by Dini's gloating.
Around this time, Mike Merlo was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 44. Although Merlo was a lifelong friend of the Gennas and protector, this diagnosis was good news for the brothers. Torrio and Capone were not Sicilian, therefore the brothers did not need their approval to whack Dini, they only needed approval from the Unione. The peaceful Torrio was desperately worried about a gang war if either clan decided to whack the Irishman, but the Gennas didn't care. As they seen it, Dini had openly mocked their heritage and everything they stand for. And as Mike Merlo's health continued to deteriorate, the brothers hatched a plan, one which would rid Chicago of the Irishman once and for all.
Tensions reached a boiling point in November 1924 when Dini's dealings with the brothers became more volatile. After learning that Bloody Angelo had racked up a $30,000 debt at a casino next door to the Hawthorne Hotel called The Ship, which the North and Southsiders co-owned, Dini made a rash decision. In front of members of the Southsiders, including Torrio and Capone, at the Hawthorne Hotel, Dini called Angelo and demanded payment within a week, despite an agreement in place allowing Angelo and the rest of the brothers to run up debts there. Therefore, the move was seen as a great insult to the Gennas and even Dini's right-hand man, Polish-born killer Jaime Weiss, and a mobster so dangerous that he was described as the only man that Al Capone ever feared, tried to calm Dini down But it was to no avail. Dini eventually stormed out of the meeting after calling Torrio and Capone lousy wops again and shouting to hell with those Sicilians, meaning the Genna Brothers. Dini's defiance would be his undoing. His insults had reached a breaking point, and now even Torrio was in favour of whacking the Irishman. With Mike Merlo's death imminent, Dini's days were numbered. On November the 8th, 1924, Mike Merlo passed away, and suddenly, Dini got busy. The headquarters of the Northsiders was the upstairs room of Schofield's flower shop, located at 738 State Street, just across the road from the Holy Name Cathedral. Dini was a partner in the flower shop, being an enthusiastic florist in his spare time, and his shop was the go-to place for floral wreaths whenever there was a mob funeral. 2 days after Merlo's death, on the morning of November the 10th, 1924, as Mike Merlo's funeral was due to commence in just a few hours, Dini O'Banion was in the back room of Schofield's flower shop, meticulously clipping chrysanthemums to keep up with the rush of orders flooding in from Merlo's associates, not to mention preparing his own floral tribute for the head of the Unione Siciliana. Time was of the essence, and he worked quickly, his mind occupied with the looming funeral and the stacks of floral arrangements to be completed. At precisely 11:30 AM, the bells above the shop door jingled, signalling a visitor. Dini walked towards the front of the shop, his eyes immediately falling on a stout, short man, Frankie Yale, who was flanked by two unfamiliar faces. "Are you from Mike Merlo's?" Dini asked, extending his right hand to Yale, who he had never met before. But as soon as Yale gripped his hand, Dini sensed something wasn't right. Yale's handshake was unnervingly tight, almost as if he intended to never let go. At that moment, the two men standing with Yale quickly drew their pistols. Without a word, they opened fire. Bullets tore into Dini's chest and throat. One shattered his jaw in an instant. As Yale finally released his grip on Dini's hand, the once formidable Irishman crumpled to the floor, collapsing against a glass display case before slipping into death without another word.
Had Dini recognised the two men flanking Yale, his fate may have been different, for they were John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, the Genna's two top hitmen. With Yale, they rushed out of the shop and jumped into a dark blue Duet waiting nearby, driven by Mike the Devil. The quartet sped off onto Dearborn Street, vanishing into the city streets and leaving Dini O'Banion's bloody body behind. His death made shockwaves across the city, as Dini was a beloved figure, and with his presence now gone, the Gennas and the Southsiders believed that their troubles were over. But what they didn't anticipate was the fierce retaliation that came from the Northsiders, something far bloodier and more brutal than anyone could have imagined. What followed was a gang war which, quite literally, became the bloodiest in Chicago's history.
The Gennas were feeling satisfied as Dini O'Banion's funeral cortege travelled through the city. Nearly 10,000 spectators flooded North State Street to bid farewell to the head of the Northsiders. The brothers had been instrumental in his assassination, supplying the assassins and a getaway car. With Mike Merlo's death, the Unione Siciliana needed a new boss, and who else did they appoint but bloody Angelo Genna? The same man who once fought tooth and nail just to be seen as their equal, the same man who had carried out their bloodiest work without question, was now sitting at the very top of the organisation. From trusted enforcer to king of the hill, Angelo Genna was now the official president of the Unione. The Gennas were now completely untouchable and wielding power they had never experienced before, and as if the whole affair couldn't get any sweeter for the gang, the new leader of the Northsiders, Jaime Weiss, extended an olive branch to the brothers, wanting to negotiate a temporary truce. Weiss and Bugs Moran, the second in command of the gang, met with Sam and Antonio, and a truce was agreed. At this moment, Weiss did not know that the two gunmen flanking Frankie Yale when Dini was killed were the Genna's two top henchmen, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. All Weiss knew was that a Capone associate from New York, Yale, had been seen in the city around the time of his murder. Weiss had now decided to focus all out on Torrio and Capone, believing they were solely responsible for his leader's death.
Jaime Weiss really did terrify the Southsiders. Not only was he a cold-blooded killer, but he was unbelievably intimidating at sit-downs between the two factions when Dini was alive. Weiss was also suffering from terminal cancer. Knowing his days were numbered and having nothing to lose made him even more dangerous. When Johnny Torrio learned that Jaime Weiss was hellbent on avenging Dini's death, he was so concerned for his safety that he fled Chicago and headed to Hot Springs, Arkansas, waiting for the heat to die down. Meanwhile, Capone, who took charge in his absence, had all of his cars bulletproofed and employed 4 bodyguards who flanked him at all times. And this was for good measure, as it was now the behemoth that Weiss and his North Sider ruthless killing crew focused all of their attention on.
On a freezing night in January 1925, Al Capone and several of his men pulled up outside Palermo's restaurant on West 63rd Street in a sleek black sedan. As they stepped onto the icy curb, a dark green touring car that had been lying in wait across the street suddenly roared to life. From its windows erupted a furious spray of gunfire. 3 Thompson submachine guns, wielded by Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran and Vincent the Schemer Drucci, cut through the silence with a deafening rattle. The air exploded with the sound of shattering glass and screeching metal. Capone and his crew dove for cover as their car was turned into twisted scrap, riddled with over 50 bullets, yet somehow the Southside boss escaped unharmed. His enemies melted into the snowy night, leaving behind only chaos and a visibly shaken Capone. From that day forward, Capone's paranoia took full control. He became a ghost in public life, rarely leaving his house or his headquarters. The Northsiders had made their point. No one on their hit list was untouchable. Johnny Torrio, however, refused to take the same precautions. He scoffed at Capone's fears, choosing to live without bodyguards, believing that they only slowed him down. That arrogance cost him dearly. Just 12 days after the Palermo restaurant ambush, Torrio and his wife, Anna, returned to their home at 7011 South Clyde Avenue after a shopping trip. As Anna carried groceries into the house, Torrio stayed behind to help the chauffeur. Across the street, a grey automobile sat quietly with 3 figures lurking inside. Suddenly, the doors of the car burst open. Jaime Weiss emerged first, shotgun raised. The chauffeur was hit immediately. Another blast blew out the windows of Torrio's limo, showering him with shards of glass. He tried to flee towards the house, but a bullet ripped through his cheek, dropping him to the sidewalk, blood pouring from the wound. As he lay stunned and bleeding, Torrio looked up to see Bugs Moran standing over him, a pistol pressed cold against his temple. Coup de grace, compliments of Dini, Moran hissed, but when he pulled the trigger, the gun jammed. Cursing, Moran frantically tried to clear the weapon, but it wouldn't fire. From the car, Drucci shouted that neighbours were spilling out of their homes. The job had taken too long. Reluctantly, Weiss and Moran abandoned the scene and peeled off into the night.
Torrio survived, but the attack changed everything. Yes, the physical injuries would heal, but this brush with death left him haunted and exhausted. He had tasted the cost of staying in the game, and it was too high. A few weeks after, Torrio handed the reins of his Southside empire to his protege, Al Capone, who at just 26 years of age was now the king of Chicago's underworld. with the Southsiders' yearly takings around $100 million back in 1925, which would equate to about $1 billion in today's money, giving him absolutely astonishing wealth.
While bullets flew across Chicago, the Genna family had reason to celebrate. On January the 10th, 1925, Bloody Angelo married into one of Chicago's wealthiest and most prominent Italian families. His wife was Lucille Spignola, sister to Henry Spignola, a top attorney of the time who had been the main reason that Angelo got off the Paul Knott murder charge. Their wedding was one of the city's most extravagant gangster weddings. The ceremony was held at the Ashland Boulevard Auditorium with over 3,000 guests in attendance. The wedding cake alone cost $2,000, equivalent to about $35,000 today, and was a towering culinary feat. 400 pounds of sugar, 400 pounds of flour, 7 cases of eggs, 50 pounds of butter and 6 buckets of flavouring. It was excess and power on full display, whilst elsewhere in the city, the streets ran red. However, everything wasn't as bliss as the Gennas might have thought. Around this time, the crazed lunatic Jaime Weiss had just learned that it was Genna hitmen who killed his boss Dini, and with Capone rarely leaving his house, or the Southsiders' headquarters of the Hawthorne Hotel, he turned his attention to the brothers. Bloody Angelo and his new wife were making the final arrangements to move to a house they had agreed to buy at 417 Taylor Street, but had not yet signed every paper needed. So for now, they were still living in Angelo's penthouse at the Belmont Hotel. On the morning of May the 26th, 1925, Angelo left the Belmont Hotel in his Roadster coupe, on his way to make the cash payment and sign the papers for his new home. As he drove past Lincoln Park, he noticed in his rearview mirror a car gaining ground on him and recognised the men immediately. Inside the trailing vehicle was Bugs Moran, Jaime Weiss and Vincent Drucci. All three were armed and out for blood. Angelo stepped on the gas, frantically trying to make it back to the haven of Little Italy. He turned southwest onto Ogden Avenue, which at that time extended all the way to Lincoln Park, and sped towards Hudson Avenue. The Northsiders caught up alongside him, and Bugs and Weiss opened fire with their Tommy guns, hitting Angelo several times and causing him to lose control of the car and crash into a lamppost at the corner of Hudson and Ogden Avenues. Slumped against the steering wheel and riddled with bullets, Bloody Angelo was barely conscious when the Northsiders pulled up alongside him. For good measure, Jaime and Bugs fired over a dozen more rounds into his defenceless body before speeding off as Angelo began to lose consciousness. Remarkably, Bloody Angelo was still alive when the police arrived. He was rushed to the Evangelical Deaconess Hospital at 5421 South Morgan Street, where he was swiftly operated on. As the surgeons got to work, Police Sergeant Roy Hessler came to his deathbed and pleaded with the most dangerous and most feared of the Genna brothers. "You're going to die, Angelo," he said. "Tell us who bumped you off." But Bloody Angelo just shrugged his shoulders and closed his eyes. Even in his last moments, he continued to adhere to the gangster code of silence, the same one that had allowed him to evade prison throughout his short life. Bloody Angelo Genna died at 12 p.m, 2 hours after the hit, at just 27 years of age.
Angelo's death absolutely rocked the remaining brothers to their core. Mike the Devil was uncontrollable. That same evening, he was reportedly walking down Taylor Street, drunk as a skunk, brandishing 2 pistols, firing at anything and screaming uncontrollably. But he did not yet know who had killed his youngest brother and bloody partner in crime. The Chicago Tribune noted that people in the know in Taylor Street told them that you'll know who murdered Bloody Angelo when the next big guy in the city is murdered. But unfortunately for the Gennas, Angelo's death was the beginning of the end for the brothers.
Angelo Genna's funeral was, like his wedding, one of the grandest events in Chicago's history. No expense was spared, and it was intended to belittle Dini O'Banion's funeral just 6 months prior. At 10 a.m. on the 29th of May 1924, traffic was completely blocked on Taylor Street. The Yerusi Funeral Home at 761 Taylor Street, where Angelo's body rested, was packed with pallbearers and members of the Unione Siciliana. Packed into the funeral home were 50 policemen, politicians, lawyers, Labour union officials, and the Genna family. A few brief prayers were said before 31 limousines and the hearse carrying his body made its way through the streets of Chicago. The floral arrangements were estimated at around $75,000. Amongst them was an 8-foot display heavy with lilies sent by Al Capone and a massive vase of pink and white carnations from Johnny Torrio. Although they were allies, Angelo's death was convenient to Capone, as now he could have his own man, Tony Lombardo, placed as the president of the Unione. As Capone was from Naples and not Sicilian, he couldn't be the president, but by using Lombardo as a front, he wielded even more power in the city. The Northsiders also sent a floral display to Angelo's funeral. It was common practice for gangsters to send flowers to funerals, regardless of whether the deceased had been a friend or an enemy. Thousands attended Angelo's funeral. He was denied a church burial by Roman Catholic Cardinal George Mundelin, so he was laid to rest at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside. He was placed in a $6,000 casket weighing over 1,200 pounds, so heavy it nearly collapsed the back porch of the funeral parlour. Officers frisked mourners for weapons before allowing them near the gravesite. He was interred in this mausoleum, and whilst he was, the remaining 5 Genna brothers made a promise outside it to bring hell to their younger brother's killer. Mike Genna would spearhead that promise and was relentless in his pursuit of blood. He knew that the Northsiders were the only crew in town reckless enough to kill his younger brother. He began staking out their Schofield flower shop headquarters, studying their daily routines. On the 13th of June 1925, just 2 weeks after the funeral of Angelo, Mike the Devil, along with Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, was on the hunt again. The 3 Genna gunmen were trailing the Northsiders, who were collecting protection money from a speakeasy near Lincoln Park. As the Northsider car made its way down the street, the Genna trio pulled up beside it. Without warning, they leaned out the windows and opened fire with their Tommy guns. Bullets ripped through the vehicle and the Northsider's car swerved uncontrollably, narrowly avoiding a collision. The Gennas drove past, then spun around and continued the assault. Weiss and Bugs Moran were both wounded and more bullets tore into the car. The Northsiders, in panic, fired back, but only for a moment, as the Gennas soon realised that they were being pursued by the police and sped off. At 47th Street and Western Avenue, officers from the local precinct recognised Mike Genna in the vehicle and immediately suspected something illegal was going down. A quartet of police officers joined the chase, believing the gang was involved in a booze deal. The driver of the Genna's car, aware of the pursuit, gunned the engine, pushing their car to 73 miles per hour. The police were right behind them, matching their speed. Meanwhile, Mike Genna, speaking loudly in Sicilian, began giving instructions on where to flee to. At 59th Street, the pursuit reached its climax. The driver of the Genna's car tried to avoid a truck that swerved in front of them, forcing him to slam on the brakes. The car spun out of control and slammed into a lamppost.
The officers, who had been following closely, jumped out of their cars and shouted, "Hey, what's the idea? Why all the speed when we were ringing the gong?" Which was how officers raised the alarm at patrol boxes and stations. They'd have metal gongs that they would ring to summon backup whenever needed.
Back outside the Genna's car, the response from the Genna party was swift and brutal. They opened fire with a repeating shotgun, hitting Officer Harold Olson in the jaw, causing him to crumple to the ground. Officer Charles Walsh was the next target, taking a shot to the chest. The officers who were still standing returned fire, targeting Genna, Anselmi, and Scalise. Mike Genna attempted to fire back, but his gun jammed. Panicking, he and his companions fled the scene, running into an alley that ran north and south between Western and Artesian Avenue. Scalise and Anselmi turned into a passageway between houses at 6935 and 6941 Artesian Avenue, while Mike, exhausted from the chase, made a stand. Turning to face the pursuing officers, Mike Genna leveled his shotgun and pulled the trigger, but it misfired. Officer William Sweeney, quick on the draw, fired back at Mike, hitting him in the leg. The shot severed his femoral artery, sending Genna stumbling after his companions. Bleeding heavily, he ducked into the basement window of 5941 Artesian Avenue. Sweeney, followed by two other officers, entered the basement and they began firing at Genna, who was lying on the floor. In his hand, he still clutched a blue steel Spanish .38 revolver, and Genna fired a last shot before collapsing, but it wasn't enough. Sweeney's bullet had already hit him in the leg, and the wound proved fatal. As Mike lay dying, the policeman called for an ambulance. When one arrived, he kicked the ambulance driver in the face, shouting, "Take that, you son of a bitch." Mike Genna died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital at 30 years of age. Officer Olson and Officer Walsh also died from their gunshot wounds. Scalise and Anselmi, having hidden in a store, were later arrested. The police, furious over the deaths of their colleagues, gave them a severe beating during interrogation. As for Mike Genna, the family had planned a lavish send-off for him, nothing short of what they had done for Angelo. However, the funeral was anything but grand. The police, determined to crack down on gang activity, issued a stern warning. Any gangster attending the funeral would be arrested. Gangsters, fearing they'd be identified and connected to the crime, stayed away. There were no mourners from the criminal world at Mike Genna's funeral. It was a stark contrast to the public displays that had followed the death of his younger brother. Mike Genna was interred in the Genna Mausoleum next to Angelo, and 5 brothers became 4.
Within a mere 3 weeks, the Genna brothers had lost their 2 most violent and feared enforcers, Bloody Angelo and Mike the Devil, and with them, much of their fear and power. The once mighty Genna brothers, who had controlled the beer rackets of Little Italy, were quickly losing their grip. Angelo and Mike Genna really were the 2 most feared gangsters in Chicago, with perhaps only Jaime Weiss being feared as much as them. The remaining brothers, Sam, Peter, Tony and Jim, were seen as lesser figures, lacking the same deadly instincts and influence.
As the Genna family began to crumble, rival gangs in the area were eager to seize their territory. John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, both under arrest but soon to be released, found themselves lured from the Genna's ranks and joined Al Capone's Chicago outfit upon their release. They could see the cracks beginning to show in the Genna gang and defected over to the Behemoth's ranks. Giuseppe the Cavalier Spano, also known as Joseph Nerone, was particularly feeling the heat. He was one of the first to turn on the remaining Genna brothers. On July the 8th, 1925, Tony Genna received an invitation from Spano, a man he trusted, as Spano was Tony's bodyguard. Spano asked Tony to meet him at Grand Avenue and Curtis Street, a seemingly harmless location. What Tony didn't know was that the meeting had been set up by Vincent Drucci and George Bugs Moran. Tony arrived at the meeting spot, where Spano greeted him with a friendly handshake. But as Tony reached out, 2 men emerged from behind Spano and opened fire, shooting him multiple times in the chest and abdomen. Tony was rushed to the hospital. He lingered long enough to reveal the name of the man who had betrayed him, Giuseppe the Cavalier Spano. He told his older brother Sam Genna that it was Spano who had lured him to his death before he passed away, aged 34. Spano, once a close ally, had turned on Tony, just like that. The betrayal mimicked that of Dini O'Banion's death. Both had been orchestrated, a handshake with deadly precision. Sam Genna went to the morgue to claim his brother's body, which had been hastily taken to the hospital after the shooting. Tony Genna's funeral was also a far more low-key affair than Angelo's. No brass bands, no carloads of armed mourners keeping watch, no underworld tension hanging thick in the air. When Tony was finally laid to rest, interred alongside his two younger brothers in the Genna family mausoleum, one mourner stood back, stared at the stone that now sealed 3 violent men inside, and openly said, "When Judgment Day comes and them 3 graves are open, there will be hell to pay in this cemetery."
In less than 2 months, the Genna brothers had been reduced from 6 to 3. Mike, Angelo and Tony, the most feared and powerful of the brothers, were now dead. The remaining 3, Sam, Peter and Jim, lacked the strength, connections and leadership to maintain control. The walls were closing in, and the last remnants of the once feared Genna family was on the brink of collapse. Now, with the Chicago outfit led by Al Capone and the relentless Northside gangs closing in, the final 3 Gennas realised their empire was slipping away. The up-and-coming gangs of Little Italy were ready to take over. With their power broken, the remaining Gennas, fearing for their lives, fled Chicago and returned back to Sicily.
Ever loyal to the Genna brothers and refusing to defect to the Chicago outfit like Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, Samut Samatuna assumed control of what was left of the Genna gang. While hunting down the Cavalier Spano after Sam Genna revealed that he had set up Tony to be killed, Samut simultaneously defended the dwindling Genna empire in Little Italy whilst he hunted for the man who had betrayed the brothers. For 4 months, Amatuna engaged in numerous shootouts with the Northside gang, attempting to protect what remained of his gang's power. He hired budding Italian gangsters, who were not necessarily Sicilian, to fill in the place of the Gennas, who were no longer. However, despite bolstering his ranks, the Northsiders proved too reckless and too powerful, relentless in their pursuit of vengeance. On the evening of November the 10th, 1925, Amatuna was preparing for a rare night out amidst the heat on the streets. He planned to attend the opera Aida at the Auditorium Theatre with his girlfriend. As was his custom before going out for the evening, he visited a barbershop at 804 Roosevelt Road for a shave and manicure, a small luxury he always indulged in. The shop's owner, Isidore Paul, noticed that Amatuna was unaccompanied by his usual bodyguards, which was a rarity for someone in his position. When Paul commented on the absence of his security detail, Amatuna explained that he had not been able to reach them all day. Amatuna sat back in the barber chair, a hot towel applied to his face. In that quiet moment of vulnerability, disaster struck. Without warning, 2 unidentified men burst into the shop, guns drawn. Paul, the barber, screamed in alarm, drawing Amatuna's attention. Acting quickly, Amatuna ducked behind the barber chair to shield himself, but it was too late. As the gunmen opened fire, 2 shots rang out, hitting Amatuna squarely in the chest and neck. The gunmen, having accomplished their goal, fled the scene before anyone could react. The barbershop was left in chaos, and Amatuna, gravely wounded, was rushed to hospital. Despite his injuries, he was conscious long enough to request a priest to marry him to his girlfriend, Rose Picarara, before he passed away. Amatuna died 3 days later, in the early morning of November the 13th, 1925, before the ceremony could be completed. The identities of the men responsible for Amatuna's death were eventually revealed by Chicago police. Northsiders Vincent Drucci and Frank Gusenberg. Although the culprits were known, no charges were ever brought against them. The gang also had a corrupt network that they could lean on when needed.
What became a subject of suspicion in the aftermath was the absence of Amachuna's bodyguards. It was never clear whether they had been paid off to stay away that night or if they had defected to the Northside gang. His bodyguards were not Sicilian, so it's likely that they recognised that the crumbling Genna Empire was nearing its end and defected to rival gangs, which was not uncommon in Prohibition-era Chicago. Though Amachuna had tried to preserve the remnants of the Genna Empire, the death of the last significant leader of the family sealed its fate. The Northside gang had successfully eliminated their rivals, and the once feared Genna family was now no more. As for the bitter feud between the Northsiders and the Southsiders, it was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. This bitter rivalry, which would become known as the Chicago Beer Wars, reached its bloody climax with the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The tensions between the two sides would ultimately boil over into one of the most brutal and unforgettable events in gangster history. To find out exactly how it unfolded, I'll link my full 2-part documentary on Bugs Moran at the end of this video. But for now, for the Genna brothers who were not dead, Jim, Sam and Peter, their fates are one that slowly fade away.
By the start of 1926, the once mighty Genna family, known throughout Chicago for their reign over Little Italy, had been reduced to little more than a memory. Joey Aiello and his brothers had quietly absorbed the Genna's rackets, taking control of the empire that they had once ruled with an iron fist. The Aiellos were not enemies of the Gennas, far from it. Rather, they had been apprentices, with the Aiellos learning from the Gennas. Joey Aiello's first order of business to get revenge on whoever set Tony Genna up. He learned from Sam that it was Spano who double-crossed him, and that sealed the Cavalier's fate. Spano was shot dead outside a barbershop in Little Italy on January 2nd, 1926, and with that, what had once been the untouchable empire the Taylor Street Mafia so feared that it had earned the nickname of the Terrible Gennas had now been completely dismantled. Jim, Sam and Peter had fled Chicago after the deaths of their brothers, seeking refuge in Palermo along with Johnny Torrio. While Sam and Peter chose to lay low, avoiding attention, Jim had different ideas. He sought the peace of a retreat from the chaos and bloodshed that had consumed his life, yet he wasn't interested in just hiding away. Living the life of an Italian playboy, Jim frequented nightclubs and spent money like there was no tomorrow. His days were spent as a man about town, and his nights were filled with indulgence. Residing in the luxurious Villa Regia, he grew restless, soon concocting a plan to steal the famous and priceless Madonna di Trappiani church jewels. His thirst for wealth and excitement would lead him to his undoing. Caught in the act trying to steal the jewels, Jim was imprisoned at Favignana, a small island just off the eastern coast of Sicily that you could see from Marsala, where he and his brothers had grown up. Sentenced to hard labour for several years, Jim was released in 1929 and hatched a plan. Having squandered his vast fortune from the bootlegging game, Jim Genna was convinced that, despite everything, he still had the ability to dominate the Chicago rackets. The years spent away from the city had only fueled his desire to return to power, and in early 1930, he took a calculated risk. Boarding a ship from Palermo, he sailed back across the Atlantic, finally setting foot on Chicago's soil once again in May 1930. His goal was clear: to reclaim a piece of the West Side, the very turf his family had once ruled with an iron fist. Jim's return was anything but subtle. He was determined to rebuild the Genna legacy, ready to challenge anyone who stood in his way. But Chicago had undergone significant changes in the years since his escape to Italy. The once proud empire he had helped forge had crumbled, and new players had moved in to fill the void left by his family's destruction. The power he'd once enjoyed, now just a distant memory, wasn't so easily revived. On May the 31st, 1930, Jim was in a car with 4 old Genna gang members reminiscing about better days. They were driving down Peoria Street in Little Italy when suddenly a large sedan pulled up beside them.
Without warning, the car's 5 occupants unloaded a devastating barrage of shotgun blasts and revolver shots into Jim's vehicle. Philip Nolfo, one of Jim's companions, was killed instantly. 2 others in the car were also wounded, and Jim, although unscathed, realised the magnitude of the situation. The message was clear. His attempt to muscle back into the rackets had been met with a violent response, and he was no longer a force to be reckoned with.
In the aftermath of the shooting, Jim was left shaken and disillusioned. The reality of his situation hit him hard. Not only had his family's influence evaporated, but so had his own standing in the city. The piece of Chicago he once controlled was no longer his to claim. His hopes of resurrecting the Genna legacy had been shattered in an instant. With the blood of his former associates spilled on the streets, Jim knew it was time to retreat. Fleeing the scene of the attack, Jim quickly made his way to Calumet City, hoping to vanish from the criminal underworld and live out the remainder of his days from the violence that had consumed his life. For Jim Genna, the final chapter of the once feared Genna family had come to a bitter end. Jim Genna's life came to an end just a year and a half later, on November the 8th, 1931, when he died of heart disease, aged 43. His health had been deteriorating for some time, and his passing marked the 3 brothers becoming 2. Nearly 2 decades later, the last surviving Genna brothers would also pass away, having relocated back to America. On May the 13th, 1948, Peter Genna, the second to last of the brothers, died at the age of 67 after a month-long illness. And on December the 20th, 1951, Sam Genna, the last surviving brother, also passed away at the age of 67 from a heart attack in his home at 865 Blue Island Avenue. He left behind a wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. Now all 6 brothers rested together in the family mausoleum, where Angelo had been waiting for them since 1925. As for the last 2 original members of the Genna crew, the 2 men who pulled the trigger on Dini O'Banion and later defected to Al Capone's mob, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, their end wasn't so different from the fates that they handed out.
Scalise and Anselmi had made a name for themselves in Chicago's underworld as ruthless killers, the same killers who had walked into Schofield's flower shop and put an end to the Northsider boss Dini O'Banion's life in cold blood. After the hit, they switched sides, joining Capone's forces, who saw their value and brought them into the fold as trusted enforcers. For a while, they lived like kings, protected, feared, and fed. But somewhere along the line, power got to their head. Scalise and Anselmi started whispering about plans, about making their own move, about knocking off Capone and taking the outfit for themselves. Maybe they thought that their Sicilian blood gave them the right. Maybe they thought that Al Capone wouldn't see it coming, but the behemoth did see it coming.
He got wind of the plot and decided he'd deal with it in classic Capone fashion. No warnings, no second chances, just a clear message. On May the 7th, 1929, Capone invited Scalise and Anselmi to a banquet and said it was in their honour. Food, drinks, cigars, everything was laid out like a royal celebration. They showed up thinking they were about to get toasted, and they couldn't have been more wrong. Once the drinks were flowing and the mood was light, Capone stood up to speak. The room went quiet. Then, without missing a beat, he reached under the table, pulled out a baseball bat, and started swinging. blow after blow rained down on Scalise and Anselmi's skulls. No one moved, no one spoke. Just Capone bashing in the heads of the two men who thought they could cross him and lived to tell the tale. This grisly moment would go on to be immortalised in The Untouchables, where Robert De Niro, who played Al Capone, delivered the fatal beating at a dinner table in front of his whole crew, an unforgettable scene based on a very real killing. As for the man who inherited what remained of the Genna family rackets, Joey Aiello, he also faced a similar fate. Now at war with Capone after his plot to overthrow the Chicago outfit leader came unravelled, Aiello left his Chicago apartment at 205 North Colmar Avenue on the morning of October the 23rd, 1930, to enter a waiting taxicab. Before he crossed the street, a Capone gunman opened fire with a Tommy gun and hit Aiello 13 times, killing him instantly. Capone absorbed Little Italy, and the Chicago outfit ruled the city.
The once mighty Genna family, who had ruled over Chicago's Little Italy with ruthless control, had come to an end. Their empire had crumbled, and the power vacuum they left behind was quickly filled by others. But the memory of their reign and the violent battles that led to their ultimate downfall lingers in the streets they had once controlled. One street I wanted to share with you today, and just see if anyone perhaps knew anything about it, is an alleyway / ginnel type place in Marsala, Sicily, that I came across when researching Marsala. The alleyway is called Via Angelo Genna. I've researched absolutely everything I can on this and cannot find any press or history about it. If anybody knows anything, please leave a comment or get in touch via email. I'm quite sure it's not named after the Angelo Genna that our story covers, but I can't find any reference anywhere online or in any books that I have to any other Angelo Genna. So if anyone knows anything, please do get in touch, as quite frankly, it's been keeping me up at night. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. And if you really enjoyed the video, then please consider becoming a channel member, where you'll get access to weekly content, access to our private Discord as well, and also monthly live streams, which are really quite fun. So if that sounds of interest to you, then for $5 a month, it can be yours. And you can join by clicking this link, which I'll put in the video description. Again, thanks so much for watching. I really, really do appreciate it. If you've got any suggestions for who you want me to cover next, although I think it could be this man here, then please let me know. And I'll see you in the next one.